Sometimes the most powerful moment in a man's life comes when he has nothing left to lose. Victor Blackstone built his fortune destroying small towns. But tonight, he lies dying in a twisted car on a country road. An Amish elder named Jacob finds him there. Jacob has every reason to walk away. Victor tried to steal his neighbor's farm just months ago. Instead, Jacob kneels down and says 5 simple words: "I won't let you die today." Through the long night, these two men from different worlds share something neither expected. Victor faces the empty legacy he's built, while Jacob offers something Victor has never known: grace without conditions. What happens when a man who spent his life taking everything meets someone willing to give everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening air carried the scent of fresh-cut hay and honeysuckle. Across Lancaster County, when Victor Blackstone's black Mercedes sedan left the asphalt and found the ancient oak, the impact echoed across the quiet farmland like a gunshot, sending a flock of starlings spiraling into the darkening sky. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood as gasoline dripped steadily onto the gravel shoulder, each drop catching the fading light like liquid amber. Victor had been driving too fast, his mind consumed by the phone calls that wouldn't stop coming. Investors, lawyers, accountants, all of them demanding answers he didn't have. His real estate empire, built on leveraged dreams and calculated risks, was collapsing faster than he could shore up the foundation. The Amish properties he'd been quietly acquiring through shell companies were supposed to be his salvation, prime development land that nobody else wanted, or so he'd thought. Now those same properties represented his last desperate gamble, and even that was slipping through his fingers. Blood trickled from a gash above his left eyebrow, painting red streaks down his cheek. His designer suit, custom-tailored in Milan just last month, hung torn and stained. The steering wheel had caught him in the ribs, and each breath sent sharp pains through his chest. His left leg felt wrong. Not broken, perhaps, but certainly damaged. The airbag had deployed and deflated, leaving him slumped against the driver's side window like a discarded mannequin. Through the spider web of cracked glass, he could see the pastoral landscape he'd been methodically destroying for the past 2 years. Rolling hills dotted with traditional farmhouses, their windows glowing warm yellow in the gathering dusk. Clotheslines heavy with simple garments dancing in the evening breeze. Gardens bursting with tomatoes and corn, tended by hands that understood the rhythm of seasons and the patience of growing things. It was all supposed to become Blackstone Commons, a luxury shopping complex with chain restaurants and big-box stores. The kind of development that turned small communities into economic dependencies, forcing local businesses to close and families to drive miles for basic necessities. He'd done it dozens of times in dozens of places, always promising prosperity, while delivering something else entirely. His phone buzzed incessantly in the cup holder, the screen cracked but still functional. Messages from creditors, threats from investors, desperate pleas from his ex-wife about their children's college funds. Victor tried to reach for it, but his arm wouldn't cooperate. The simple movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder and down his spine. That's when he heard the footsteps. They were deliberate and unhurried, crunching softly through the gravel. Not the rushed steps of someone panicking at the sight of an accident, but the measured pace of a man accustomed to thinking before acting. Victor's vision blurred as he tried to focus on the approaching figure. Through the broken glass, he made out a tall, lean silhouette wearing the distinctive plain clothing of the Amish. Dark trousers, suspenders, and a simple shirt that spoke of humility rather than fashion. The man's face came into view as he knelt beside the wreckage, and Victor's heart sank with recognition. Jacob Miller, 62 years old, weathered hands that spoke of decades of honest labor, eyes the color of morning sky over wheat fields. The same man whose neighbor's farm Victor had been trying to acquire through legal technicalities and financial pressure. The same man who had stood quietly in the back of the town meeting 3 months ago, listening as Victor's lawyers explained eminent domain procedures and economic development benefits. Jacob's expression showed no hint of recognition, no flash of satisfaction at seeing his tormentor helpless and broken. Instead, his weathered features reflected only concern as he assessed the situation with the calm competence of someone who had delivered calves in midnight snowstorms and guided lost travelers back to safety. "Easy now," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as Pennsylvania Dutch. "Don't try to move too much. I need to see how badly you're hurt." Victor tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough that brought the metallic taste of blood to his mouth. Jacob noticed and leaned closer, his movements careful and deliberate. This close, Victor could smell the honest sense that clung to the older man. Soap made from lye and animal fat, the lingering sweetness of hay, the clean smell of someone who worked with his hands and slept with a clear conscience. "I know you." Victor finally managed to whisper, each word an effort. "You're Miller, Jacob Miller." Jacob's hands paused in their examination of Victor's injuries, but his expression didn't change. "Yes, I am, and you're Victor Blackstone." There it was, the moment when recognition should have turned to judgment, when the man whose community Victor had been systematically dismantling should have walked away and left him to face the consequences of his choices alone. Victor closed his eyes and waited for the words that would seal his fate. The accusation, the abandonment, the justice he probably deserved. Instead, Jacob's voice remained steady and compassionate. "I won't let you die today." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction. Victor's eyes flew open, searching Jacob's face for some sign of irony or cruelty, but found only sincere determination. The Amish elder was already examining the twisted metal around Victor's legs, his experienced hands probing for the safest way to extract him from the wreckage without causing further injury. "Why?" Victor asked, the question barely audible above the hiss of steam and the distant sound of evening prayers drifting from the farmhouse windows. Jacob didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the car through the passenger side window, which had somehow remained intact, and carefully felt for Victor's pulse at his wrist. His fingers were rough from decades of farm work, but surprisingly gentle as they pressed against Victor's skin. "Because that's what we do," Jacob finally replied, beginning to clear away the larger pieces of broken glass. "We help those who need helping." Victor's designer watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than most people made in a year, had stopped at 7:23, the exact moment of impact. Its crystal face was spider-webbed with cracks, and blood from Victor's wrist had seeped beneath the broken glass. The irony wasn't lost on him. All his life he'd been obsessed with time, deadlines, market timing, beating competitors to the punch. Now time had stopped, at least for him, in a way he'd never imagined. "My phone," Victor whispered. "I need to call." "Nobody's going anywhere tonight," Jacob interrupted gently. "Storm's coming in, and the nearest hospital is 40 miles. Best thing right now is to keep you stable until help arrives." As if summoned by his words, thunder rumbled in the distance. The evening sky, which had been painted in soft pastels just minutes before, was darkening rapidly as storm clouds gathered. The first fat raindrops spattered against the windshield, mixing with the blood and creating pink rivulets that ran down the glass like tears. Jacob moved with quiet efficiency, using his pocket knife to cut away the airbag and clear more space around Victor. His movements spoke of someone who had dealt with emergencies before: barn fires, injured animals, the countless small crises that marked rural life. There was no panic in him, no wasted motion, just the calm competence of a man who understood that some problems couldn't be rushed. From his pants pocket, Jacob produced a clean handkerchief and began gently cleaning the blood from Victor's forehead. The cloth smelled of lavender and sunshine, clearly laundered by loving hands and folded with care. As he worked, Jacob hummed softly under his breath, not a tune Victor recognized, but something that spoke of old hymns and simple faith. "I tried to buy the Zimmerman place," Victor said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "Your neighbor's farm. I was going to tear it down." Jacob's hands never paused in their careful ministrations. "I know. You should leave me here." Victor's voice was growing weaker, and he could feel consciousness slipping away at the edges. "I'm not a good man, Jacob Miller. I destroy things. I take what doesn't belong to me." For the first time, Jacob's movement stilled. He sat back on his heels and looked directly into Victor's eyes. In the fading light, his weathered face seemed carved from the same patient stone as the ancient farmhouse foundations that dotted the landscape. "We all make choices," Jacob said quietly. "Some we're proud of, some we're not. But lying here bleeding doesn't make you less human, Victor Blackstone. It just makes you someone who needs help." The rain began in earnest now, drumming against the car's roof and running in sheets down the windows. Jacob pulled a worn piece of canvas from somewhere. Perhaps his wagon, Victor realized, glimpsing the horse and buggy pulled off to the side of the road, and stretched it over the worst of the broken glass to keep them both dry in the growing darkness, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. Victor found himself studying this man who should have been his enemy. Jacob's face bore the deep lines that came from years of outdoor work and honest laughter. His hands, now busy fashioning a more effective shelter from the storm, moved with the confidence of someone who had built things that lasted. There was a quality to his stillness that Victor had never encountered in his world of constant motion and endless acquisition. A sense of being completely present, completely at peace with where he was and what he was doing. "I don't understand you," Victor admitted as Jacob adjusted the canvas to keep the worst of the rain off them both. Jacob smiled then, the first real smile Victor had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, revealing the gentle humor that lived beneath his serious exterior. "Most folks don't understand us Amish," he replied. "We live different, think different, but understanding isn't always necessary for kindness." As the storm settled in for the night, Victor Blackstone, destroyer of communities, builder of nothing that mattered, found himself completely dependent on the grace of a man whose life he had tried to destroy. And for the first time in years, he began to wonder if there might be something worth learning in that strange reversal of fortune. The rain drummed harder against their makeshift shelter as Victor drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he surfaced from the grey fog of shock and pain, Jacob was there, adjusting the canvas, checking his pulse, or simply sitting quietly beside him with the patience of someone who understood that healing couldn't be hurried. During one of these lucid moments, Victor became acutely aware of the weight in his vest pocket, his father's pocket watch, the one thing he'd inherited that meant something beyond its monetary value. It had belonged to his grandfather too, and his great-grandfather before that, a simple brass timepiece that had marked the hours of 4 generations of Blackstone men. Victor had carried it every day for 20 years, though he'd never worn it. In his world of digital efficiency and split-second timing, an old mechanical watch seemed quaint, almost primitive. Now, with Jacob's help, he managed to extract the watch from his pocket. The chain was tangled, and his hand shook too much to work it free, so Jacob took it gently and held it up to catch what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "My father gave this to me," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said his father gave it to him and so on, the only thing I kept when I sold everything else." Jacob examined the watch with careful attention, turning it over to read the inscription on the back. "It's beautiful work. Time is the most precious gift we can give." "John, that's what it says here." Victor laughed bitterly, the sound turning into a cough that brought fresh pain to his ribs. "Ironic, isn't it? I've spent my entire life trying to buy more time, faster deals, quicker profits, beating everyone else to the finish line. Never stopped to think about what I was really giving up." Jacob carefully wound the watch, and to both men's surprise, it began ticking again. The soft, steady rhythm seemed to anchor them both in the storm's chaos. Jacob placed it gently on Victor's chest, where the regular tick-tick-tick could be felt as well as heard. "My father used to say that time isn't something you save or spend," Jacob said thoughtfully. "It's something you share." He'd pull out his watch, not so fine as this one, mind you, and he'd say, "Jacob, when you give someone your time, you're giving them a piece of your life you'll never get back. Make sure it's worth giving." Victor stared up at the canvas ceiling, listening to the watch tick against his chest. "I haven't given anyone my time in years. Not real time. Not the kind that matters." "What do you mean?" The question hung in the air as Victor struggled to find words for something he'd never articulated before. The rain provided a gentle backdrop to his thoughts, washing the world clean around them while he sorted through the debris of his choices. "I had meetings scheduled for today," he finally said. 3 of them. Important meetings about acquisitions and developments. If I'd made those meetings, I would have spent maybe 4 hours total actually present in those rooms. But I wouldn't have really been there. I'd have been thinking about the next meeting, the next deal, the next opportunity. I'd have been performing the role of Victor Blackstone, successful developer, while the real me was somewhere else entirely. Jacob nodded slowly, understanding in a way that surprised Victor. We have a saying, the heart that's always racing never hears the rhythm of life. Is that from the Bible? No, that's from my grandmother. She had a lot of wisdom that didn't make it into any book. Jacob adjusted his position slightly, mindful of Victor's injuries. She used to say that God gave us heartbeats, not heart races. There's a reason for the space between each beat. It's where the peace lives. Victor closed his eyes and tried to feel his own heartbeat, but all he could sense was the pain radiating through his body and the growing cold as shock set in. "I think I'm dying, Jacob." "Not on my watch," Jacob replied firmly. "But I won't lie to you. You're hurt badly, and we're a long way from help. The question is what you want to do with whatever time you have left." It was the first time anyone had spoken to Victor so directly about his mortality without trying to reassure him with empty platitudes. In his business world, death was something that happened to other people, something to be avoided through better health care, safer investments, smarter choices. The idea that his money and influence couldn't protect him from this moment was both terrifying and strangely liberating. "I want to understand something," Victor said slowly. 3 months ago, I sent lawyers to your community meeting. They explained how we could use eminent domain to acquire your neighbor's farm, whether he wanted to sell or not. You were there. You heard everything. I was there. You knew I was planning to destroy your way of life, turn your farmland into strip malls and parking lots, drive out families that have been there for generations. Victor's voice grew stronger as anger gave him energy. "So why are you helping me? Why aren't you letting me die here like I probably deserve?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Victor wondered if he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were choosing each one with care. "Because revenge isn't the same as justice, and justice isn't the same as mercy. My father taught me that with more than words." "What do you mean?" Jacob reached into his pants pocket and pulled out a small leather case. Inside was another pocket. Watch, far simpler than Victor's but clearly well maintained. The case was worn smooth from decades of handling, and the brass had developed the deep patina that comes only with age and love. When I was about 16, I got it in my head that the English, what we call people outside our community, were all against us. There'd been some incidents. Kids throwing rocks at our buggies, people making fun of how we dressed, business owners in town treating us like we were backward or stupid. I was angry all the time, looking for reasons to fight. He opened the watch case and showed Victor the timepiece inside. The face was cracked, and the hands had frozen at 2:15. One afternoon, I was working in town, helping to repair a roof that had been damaged in a storm. There was this man A developer like you who kept making jokes about the simple folk and how we were holding back progress. Finally, I'd had enough. I jumped down from that roof and went after him with a hammer in my hand. Victor's eyes widened. The idea of Jacob Miller, with his gentle demeanor and soft-spoken ways, attacking someone with a hammer seemed impossible. I didn't hit him, Jacob continued quickly, but I wanted to. I raised that hammer above my head, ready to bring it down, when my father stepped between us. He didn't say a word, just looked at me with such disappointment that it stopped me. He cold. Then he took this watch from his pocket, it was still working then, and he threw it against the side of the building as hard as he could. Why would he do that? Because he wanted me to understand what I was about to do. That watch had belonged to his father, and his father before him. It was the most precious thing he owned, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. Time. Spent with love, passed down through generations. When I saw it broken on the ground, I realized that's what violence does. It breaks the most precious things, and some things, once broken, can never be fixed. Jacob closed the watch case and returned it to his pocket. He never had it repaired, said it would serve as a reminder that anger can destroy what took generations to build. Every day after that, when I felt anger rising up in me, I'd remember the sound that watch made when it hit the ground. Victor stared at this man who had every reason to hate him and was instead risking his own safety to keep him alive. But I'm everything you stood against that day. I'm the developer who wants to tear down your world. Yes, you are, Jacob agreed, without hesitation. But you're also a man bleeding in a car wreck who needs help. The question isn't whether you deserve my help. The question is whether I deserve to be the kind of man who would withhold it. The simple profundity of that statement hit Victor like a physical blow. In all his years of deal-making and negotiation, he had never encountered logic quite like Jacob's. It turned the entire concept of deserving on its head, making mercy a choice about the giver rather than the receiver. I don't know how to be helped, Victor admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I've spent so long being the one with power, the one making the offers, that I don't know how to accept something freely given. Then this might be the most important lesson you'll ever learn, Jacob replied. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else be strong for you. As if summoned by his words, lightning illuminated the landscape around them, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. In that brief, stark light, Victor saw Jacob's face clearly, lined with years of honest living, marked by sorrows and joys that had been met with equal grace. There was something in that weathered countenance that spoke of depths Victor had never imagined, a quiet strength that came from sources he didn't understand. The watch on his chest continued its steady ticking, marking moments that suddenly felt more precious than any he'd ever known. Each beat was a gift, not purchased, not negotiated, but simply given by a man who understood something about time that Victor was only beginning to glimpse. "Jacob," he whispered, "I think I'm starting to understand why you people live the way you do." The Amish elder smiled, his face gentle in the storm's reflected light. "Understanding's a start," he said, "but living it, that's the hard part." As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Victor's condition began to fluctuate. Wildly. One moment he would be lucid and coherent. The next he would slip into fevered hallucinations that blurred the line between past and present. Jacob remained steadfast beside him, monitoring his breathing and pulse, while offering quiet reassurance during the worst moments. It was during one of these fevered episodes that Victor began talking about his children. "Sarah's graduating this spring," he mumbled, his words slurring together as pain medication from the first aid kit Jacob had retrieved from his buggy began to take effect. "Valedictorian, full scholarship to Princeton. I should be proud, shouldn't I?" Jacob continued his careful tending of Victor's wounds while listening. "You should be very proud. That's quite an accomplishment. But I missed her science fair, and her debate tournament, and her birthday last year. Victor's voice cracked with something that might have been tears or might have been blood. I was closing a deal in Phoenix, a strip mall that nobody needed in a town that didn't want it. But the margins were good, and the timeline was tight, and I told myself I'd make it up to her later. Jacob's hands paused in their work. Did you make it up to her? I bought her a car, a BMW. Thought that would show her how proud I was. Victor's laugh turned into a cough. She drove it exactly once, then parked it in the garage and went back to riding the bus. When I asked why, she said the car felt like an apology for something I'd never actually apologized for. The admission hung in the air between them, made more poignant by the gentle sound of rain on canvas and the steady ticking of the pocket watch on Victor's chest. Jacob reached into his own pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a small photograph that had clearly been handled many times. "This is my granddaughter Rebecca," he said, holding the photo where Victor could see it despite the poor light. "She's 16 now, but this picture was taken when she was 12, the day she won the county spelling bee. Even in the dim light, Victor could make out the image of a young Amish girl in traditional dress, her face bright with joy and accomplishment. What struck him most was the obvious pride in her expression, not the polished, performance-ready smile he was accustomed to seeing in his own family photos, but the genuine, unguarded happiness of a child who knew she was loved for who she was, not what she achieved. "The tournament was on a Saturday," Jacob continued, "which is our preparation day for Sunday worship. I had 3 wagons that needed repair, a sick horse, and about a dozen other pressing matters. But when Rebecca asked if I'd be there to watch her compete, there wasn't even a question. And the wagons got fixed on Monday. The horse recovered. The other matters sorted themselves out, as most matters do if you give them time." Jacob returned the photo to his wallet with obvious care. "But Rebecca only had 1 spelling bee that day. Some things you can't reschedule." Victor closed his eyes, remembering all the things he'd rescheduled, postponed, or missed entirely in the name of business efficiency. Birthday parties moved to weekends that were more convenient for his calendar. School plays attended via his assistant's video recordings because he couldn't leave a board meeting. Christmas mornings cut short because the Tokyo markets opened early. "My son Michael asked me once why I worked so hard," Victor said quietly. "He was maybe 10 years old, and I'd just gotten home from a 2-week business trip. He wanted me to help him with a school project about family traditions. I told him I worked hard so I could give him and Sarah everything I never had when I was growing up. What did he say to that? He asked what I never had. When I told him about sharing a bedroom with my brothers and wearing hand-me-down clothes and never going on family vacations, he got this confused look on his face. Then he said, 'But Dad, I have my own bedroom and new clothes, and we go lots of places, but I still don't have you.'" The simple wisdom of a child's observation cut through Victor's defenses like a blade. He had spent decades building an empire designed to give his children everything he'd lacked, only to discover that what they actually lacked was the one thing his empire couldn't provide: his presence, his attention, his time. Jacob reached into his first aid supplies and retrieved a small bottle of water. He helped Victor take a few sips, then used some of the water to dampen a clean cloth and gently clean the dried blood from around Victor's mouth. The gesture was so tender, so naturally caring, that Victor felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had nothing to do with his injuries. "When did you last see them?" Jacob asked gently. "Your children?" Victor had to think about it, which was answer enough. "Michael's wedding was 8 months ago. I gave a toast about success and achievement. I don't think I mentioned love once." He paused, struggling with the memory. "Sarah called me on Thanksgiving, but I was reviewing contracts for a deadline. I told her I'd call back after I finished. I never did." "Did she call again?" "No, she never calls anymore. Neither does Michael. My ex-wife says they've given up trying to compete with my work for my attention." Victor's voice grew smaller. "I think they were right to give up." Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, but it seemed to be moving away from them. The worst of the storm was passing, though the rain continued steadily. "I had a brother once," Jacob said finally. "Eli. He was 2 years younger than me, and everything I wasn't. Where I was serious, he was full of laughter. Where I followed rules, he asked questions. Where I accepted what I was told, he wanted to understand why." Victor sensed this was a story Jacob didn't tell often, if ever. The older man's voice carried a weight that spoke of old pain, carefully tended, but never fully healed. When Eli turned 18, he decided he wanted to see the English world before committing to baptism and our way of life. It's not uncommon. We call it rumspringa, the running around time. Most young people explore a little and then come home, ready to settle down and join the church. But Eli didn't come home. Oh, he came home several times. But each time, he seemed more restless, more convinced that there was something out there he was missing. Finally, when he was 22, he told our father he couldn't live our way anymore. Said he needed more than what our community could offer. Jacob's hands had stilled in their ministrations, and Victor could see the pain etched in the older man's profile. I was angry with him. Told him he was being selfish, throwing away everything our family had built for generations. I said if he left, he shouldn't expect to be welcomed back. And he left anyway, moved to Philadelphia, got a job in construction, married an Englishwoman. For 3 years, I held on to my anger like it was something precious. When he'd write letters or call, I refused to speak to him. I told myself I was protecting our community, upholding our values. Victor could hear the regret in Jacob's voice, the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. What happened to him? Construction accident. A scaffold collapsed on a job site. Downtown, he was taken to the hospital, but by the time we got word and made the trip, he was already gone. Jacob's voice broke slightly. The last words I ever said to my brother were angry ones. The last chance I had to show him love, I chose pride instead. The two men sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in the weight of irreversible choices. Victor thought about his own children, about all the words left unspoken, and the love left unexpressed, while he chased after things that had seemed more important in the moment. "I found this in his belongings when we went to collect them," Jacob continued, reaching into his wallet again. This time, he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of handling. It's a letter he wrote but never sent. In it, he said he'd never stopped loving our family or our way of life. He just wanted to understand if there might be a different way to live faithfully in the world. "Did you ever find peace with it?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Eventually, but it took years, and it came at a cost. I learned that love has to be bigger than our understanding of what's right. That grace has to be stronger than our need to be justified." He carefully refolded the letter and returned it to his wallet. "Your children are still alive, Victor. Your story with them isn't finished yet." Victor felt tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I don't know how to reach them anymore. I don't even know who they are beyond what I see in their social media posts and Christmas cards. Then maybe the first step is learning to see them as people instead of extensions of yourself," Jacob suggested gently. "Children aren't investments that pay dividends. They're gifts that teach us how to love without expecting anything in return." As the night deepened around them and Victor's strength ebbed and flowed like the tide, he found himself thinking not about his empire or his debts or his reputation, but about a little girl who parked her BMW and rode the bus because she wanted. Her father's presence more than his presence, and a little boy who asked the one question that revealed the emptiness at the heart of everything Victor had built. The rain had softened to a gentle patter by the time Victor's panic attack began. It started as a tightness in his chest that he initially attributed to his injuries, but quickly escalated into full-blown hyperventilation as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. He was going to die here, in this crumpled car on a lonely road, and nobody would find him until morning. His empire would collapse, his children would inherit his debts instead of his legacy, and he would be remembered as the man who destroyed communities for profit. Jacob recognized the signs immediately. Without hesitation, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth from decades of handling, and the pages were soft with age and constant use. Even in the dim light, Victor could see that it was a Bible, not the ornate gilt-edged version he'd received for confirmation and never opened, but a working book that showed signs of daily study. "Easy now," Jacob said in the same calm tone he'd used throughout their ordeal. "You're safe. You're not alone." He opened the Bible to a page marked with a simple ribbon bookmark. "My father read from this book every morning before dawn, and every evening after supper. It was as much a part of his daily routine as feeding the livestock or checking the weather." Victor tried to speak, but the words came out as gasps and wheezes. His chest felt like it was being squeezed by invisible hands, and spots danced at the edges of his vision. He was drowning in air, suffocating on his own fear. "Listen to my voice," Jacob continued, beginning to read in the gentle cadence of someone who had spoken these words countless times. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The familiar words, even spoken by someone from a world so different from his own, began to have a calming effect on Victor's racing mind. He had heard the 23rd Psalm at funerals and weddings, had even recited it as a child, but he had never really listened to what it meant. Now, trapped and broken and utterly dependent on the kindness of a stranger, the words took on new resonance. "He restoreth my soul," Jacob continued, his voice steady and sure. "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Victor's breathing began to slow as he focused on Jacob's voice rather than his own terror. There was something in the older man's delivery that spoke of deep familiarity with both the words and their meaning, not the performative recitation of someone going through religious motions, but the lived experience of someone who had found comfort in these promises during his own dark nights. "I don't believe in God," Victor whispered when he could speak again. "Haven't for years, maybe never really did." Jacob nodded without judgment. "That's honest, more honest than most people are willing to be. Doesn't that bother you? That you're helping someone who thinks your whole life is based on a fairy tale?" Jacob closed the Bible but kept it in his hands, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the cover. "My faith isn't so fragile that it needs your agreement to survive, and your doubt doesn't make you less worthy of help." Victor stared at this man, who seemed to inhabit a different universe than the one he knew. In Victor's world, everything was transactional. Beliefs were leverage, relationships were networking opportunities, and kindness was a strategic choice designed to produce specific outcomes. The idea that someone could offer genuine care without expecting anything in return, not even philosophical agreement, was as foreign to him as the horse-drawn buggy parked beside the road. "I used to pray," Victor admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "When I was young, before I learned that you can't pray your way out of poverty or into success. When my father died, I prayed for a miracle. When my mother got sick, I prayed for healing. When my first business failed, I prayed for another chance. Nothing happened, no answers, no interventions, no miracles. What did happen?" The question caught Victor off guard. He had expected Jacob to defend prayer or offer platitudes about God's mysterious ways. Instead, the older man seemed genuinely curious about Victor's experience. "I learned to rely on myself," Victor said after a moment. "I studied harder, worked longer hours, took bigger risks. I stopped waiting for divine intervention and started creating my own opportunities. And that worked for a while. Better than prayer ever did. Every success I achieved came from my own efforts, my own intelligence, my own willingness to do what others wouldn't." Victor's voice grew stronger as he talked about familiar territory. I never asked anyone for help, never expected charity, never waited for someone else to solve my problems. Jacob was quiet for a long moment considering this. Then he said something that surprised Victor completely. That sounds exhausting. What? Carrying the weight of everything by yourself. Never being able to rest because everything depends on your next decision, your next move, your next success. Never being able to trust that anyone else might share the load or help carry you when you stumble. Victor had never thought of his self-reliance as a burden before. It had always been his greatest strength, the foundation of everything he had accomplished. But as he lay there, completely helpless and dependent on Jacob's grace, he began to see it from a different angle. I watched my father fail, Victor said quietly. He believed in working hard and treating people fairly and trusting that good things would come to good people. He died broke and bitter, feeling like the world had betrayed him. I swore I would never be that naive. So you decided to be the one doing the betraying instead of the one being betrayed? The accusation hit Victor like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. He had built his empire on the principle that if someone was going to get hurt in a business deal, it wouldn't be him. If someone was going to be disappointed, it wouldn't be him. If someone was going to be left out in the cold, it would be the other person. I never set out to hurt people, Victor said defensively. I just set out to win. And in your world, someone has to lose for someone else to win. Victor started to answer yes automatically, then stopped. Was that really true? Or was that just the story he'd told himself to justify choices he wasn't proud of? I bought the Zimmerman farm through a shell company, he admitted suddenly, used legal technicalities and financial pressure to force an old man to sell land that had been in his family for 4 generations. I told myself it was just business, that he'd be better off with the money than struggling to keep a failing farm afloat. Jacob's expression didn't change, but Victor could feel the weight of the older man's attention. The day he signed the papers, his granddaughter was there. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, and she kept asking her grandfather why they had to leave the only home she'd ever known. He didn't have an answer for her. Victor's voice broke slightly. I watched from my car as they loaded their belongings into a pickup truck. That little girl was crying, and the old man just stood there looking at the house like he was saying goodbye to his whole life. Did you feel anything in that moment? Victor closed his eyes, remembering. I told myself I felt relief that a difficult negotiation was finally concluded. I told myself the old man would be happier in a retirement community where he wouldn't have to worry about crop failures or equipment repairs. I told myself the little girl would adjust and might even thank me someday for forcing her family into a better situation. But what did you actually feel? Sick, Victor whispered. I felt sick to my stomach. But I ignored it, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting that what I was doing was wrong, and I couldn't afford to think that way, not if I wanted to keep building my empire. Jacob reached out and gently adjusted Victor's position, to ease the pressure on his injured ribs. The gesture was so natural, so unconsciously caring, that it brought tears to Victor's eyes. I don't know how to stop being who I am, Victor said. Even if I survive this, even if I want to change, I don't know how to be someone who builds things up instead of tearing them down. I don't know how to create value without destroying something else. I don't even know how to have a relationship with my own children that isn't based on what I can give them or what they can achieve. Jacob opened his Bible again, this time to a different page. My father struggled with anger, he said simply. Not the explosive kind that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that eats away at you from the inside. He'd been cheated by business. Partners had equipment stolen, lost crops to weather that seemed designed to test his faith. By the time I was old enough to understand, he was a bitter man who trusted no one and expected the worst from everyone. What changed him? My mother died when I was 12. Influenza that turned into pneumonia. We couldn't afford the medical. and care she needed, and she died at home with nothing but prayer and love to comfort her. Jacob's voice grew soft with old grief. My father blamed God, blamed the doctors, blamed the world, but mostly he blamed himself for not being able to save her. Victor waited, sensing there was more to the story. For about a year after that, he was the angriest man I'd ever seen. He'd rail against God during family prayers, argue with the ministers, question everything he'd ever believed. Some people in the community thought he was losing his faith, but I think he was actually finding it for the first time. How do you mean? He stopped pretending he had all the answers, started admitting he was scared and hurt and confused, and when he finally ran out of anger, he discovered something underneath it he'd never expected to find. What? Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Peace. Not the kind that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes from being honest about not having anything figured out and being okay with that. Victor tried to imagine such peace and found he couldn't. His entire life had been built on having answers, on projecting confidence even when he felt lost, on maintaining control even when everything was spinning into chaos. The night before he died, he was 83 by then, he called me to his bedside and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Jacob, I spent the first half of my life trying to prove I was strong enough to handle anything God could throw at me, and the second half learning I was weak enough to need his help with everything. The second half was better." As the storm continued to move away from them and the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Victor found himself wondering for the first time in decades what it might feel like to stop carrying the weight of everything alone, to admit weakness without seeing it as failure, to need help without considering it defeat. It was a foreign concept, as alien to his understanding as the gentle man who sat beside him offering comfort to someone who had tried to destroy his world. But lying there in the wreckage of both his car and his certainties, Victor began to wonder if there might be another way to live, one he had never been brave enough to consider before. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds, Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper that had clearly been carried for many years. The edges were worn soft, and the creases had been reinforced with careful mending. When he unfolded it, Victor could see it was covered with delicate pencil drawings, geometric patterns that seemed to dance across the page in intricate, mesmerizing designs. "My wife Martha drew these," Jacob said softly, holding the paper so Victor could see it better. "She was working on a quilt pattern the week before she passed, said she wanted to create something that would bring the whole community together, every family contributing a piece, every hand helping with the stitching." Victor studied the drawings with growing fascination. Even in his weakened state, he could appreciate the mathematical precision and artistic beauty of the interlocking patterns. Each element was simple on its own, but together they created something far more complex and beautiful than the sum of its parts. "It's remarkable," Victor said honestly. "I've seen quilts in museums that weren't half as sophisticated as this design." Jacob smiled with obvious pride and deep sadness. Martha had a gift for seeing how separate things could become something greater when they were brought together with love and patience. She used to say that quilting was like building a community. Every piece matters, every stitch counts, and the final result only works if everyone contributes their best effort. Did she finish it? The quilt? Jacob shook his head. The cancer took her before she could even start cutting the fabric, but the women in our community found the pattern after the funeral and decided to complete it as a memorial. It took them 2 years, working together every Wednesday evening. When they finished, they presented it to me at the church social. Victor tried to imagine such a gesture, an entire community coming together to honor one woman's vision, completing something she could never finish herself, creating beauty from shared loss. In his world, when someone died, their projects died with them. Contracts were cancelled, partnerships dissolved, dreams abandoned. Where is the quilt now? Hanging in the meeting hall where everyone can see it. Martha always said her art was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Jacob carefully refolded the pattern sketches. But I carry these drawings with me because sometimes I need to remember what she taught me about building things that last. What did she teach you? Jacob settled back against the side of the car, his weathered face thoughtful in the growing light. That the most beautiful things in life are created slowly, with many hands contributing to the work. That shortcuts usually lead to disappointment. That patience isn't just waiting for something to happen, it's continuing to work with love and care, even when you can't see the final result. Victor thought about his own approach to building: fast construction, cheap materials, maximum profit margins. His developments were designed to go up quickly and generate immediate returns, not to last for generations or serve as gathering places for communities. He had always been proud of his efficiency, but now he wondered what he might have created if he had approached building the way Martha approached quilting. "I've never built anything that would take 2 years to complete," Victor admitted. "In my business, time is money, and patience is a luxury you can't afford if you want to stay competitive." "What's the longest you've ever spent on a single project?" Victor thought about it. 8 months, maybe 9. A shopping complex in Virginia that had some zoning complications, but even that felt like forever. I kept pushing the contractors to find ways to speed things up, cut corners where we could, anything to get it finished and generating revenue. "And how did it turn out?" "It's profitable," Victor said automatically, then paused. "But it's ugly, functional but ugly. The kind of place people go because they have to, not because they want to. I drive past it sometimes when I'm in the area, and it always feels like a missed opportunity." Jacob nodded, understanding. "Martha used to say that when you rush beauty, you usually end up with something that works but doesn't inspire. She'd rather spend months getting a single block perfect than finish a whole quilt that was merely adequate." "But didn't that drive you crazy, waiting so long to see results?" "Sometimes," Jacob admitted with a chuckle, "especially when I was younger and thought speed was the same thing as progress. But Martha taught me that there's a difference between building something and growing something. Buildings can be constructed quickly, but communities have to be grown slowly, with care and patience and attention to the needs of everyone involved." Victor stared up at the lightening sky, thinking about this distinction. His entire career had been focused on building, structures, wealth, market position, personal reputation. But what had he grown? What had he nurtured that was stronger now than when he started? "I think I've been building my whole life when what my children needed was for me to grow with them," Victor said quietly. "I constructed a successful business and a profitable portfolio and an impressive resume, but I never grew a relationship with my son or daughter that could weather difficulties or change or disappointment." "Well, what's the difference?" Victor struggled to articulate something he was only beginning to understand. "Building is about control. You have blueprints and schedules and specifications, and you force materials into the shapes you want them to take. But growing—" he paused, searching for words. "Growing requires you to pay attention to what something needs to become itself, not what you need it to become for you." Jacob's face lit up with recognition. Martha would have liked that insight. She always said the most beautiful quilts were the ones where she let the fabric tell her what it wanted to be, rather than forcing it into a pattern it couldn't support. "I forced my children into patterns they couldn't support," Victor realized. Aloud, "I had such a clear vision of what successful children should look like, the schools they should attend, the achievements they should pursue, the careers that would reflect well on the family name. I never stopped to ask what they actually wanted to become. Do you know what they want now?" Victor felt the familiar shame of not knowing his own children well enough to answer the question. "Sarah wants to be a teacher, I think. Something about working with underprivileged kids. I told her it was a waste of her intelligence and her Princeton education. Michael wants to be a photographer, not wedding photography or commercial work, but documentary photography that tells important stories about people who usually get ignored. I told him it wasn't a real career. What did they say to that? Nothing. They just stopped sharing their dreams with me. Victor's voice cracked slightly. I thought I was protecting them from making unrealistic choices that would lead to financial struggle. Instead, I was teaching them that their father's love was conditional on their willingness to live his dreams instead of their own. Jacob was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of that realization settle between them. Then he said, "It's not too late to learn their real dreams." People usually don't stop wanting to share what matters to them. They just stop sharing it with people who consistently reject or diminish what they care about. But how do I rebuild trust that took years to destroy? How do I convince them that I've changed when I'm not even sure I know how to change? The same way Martha's community finished her quilt, Jacob replied, one stitch at a time, with patience and love and commitment to the process, even when you can't see the final result. And with the understanding that some of the most beautiful things in life require many people working together, each contributing their own unique gifts. Victor thought about his children, really thought about them, not as extensions of his own ambitions, but as separate people with their own hopes and fears and dreams. Sarah, with her fierce intelligence and her desire to help children who reminded her of the father she'd once known, before success had hardened him into someone who measured love in BMW payments and college tuition checks. Michael, with his artistic eye and his compassion for stories that needed telling, even if they would never make him wealthy. "I want to try," Victor said finally. "I don't know if I can change everything about who I am, but I want to try to be the kind of father they deserve, even if it takes years to prove I'm serious." Jacob smiled, the expression warm in the growing dawn light. "That sounds like the beginning of growing something beautiful. Martha always said the most important moment in any creation is when you decide to begin, even if you can't see how it will end." As the storm clouds cleared and the first real sunlight in hours began to warm their makeshift shelter, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal or the rush of winning a negotiation, but the quiet hope that comes from deciding to build something that matters more than profit, something that grows stronger with time rather than weaker, something that serves others rather than just serving himself. It was a fragile feeling, as delicate as Martha's pencil sketches, and as patient as her community's commitment to finishing what she had started. But it was real, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Victor began to believe that real might be enough. The morning sun revealed the full extent of damage to both the car and Victor's body, but it also brought something unexpected: the sound of approaching vehicles. Jacob raised his head, listening carefully to distinguish between the rumble of engines and the steady clop of horse hooves that meant help was coming from his own community. "Sounds like both," Jacob said with obvious relief. "English vehicles and Amish buggies. Word must have spread." Victor's watch, the expensive timepiece that had stopped at the moment of impact, caught the early sunlight and threw fractured rainbows across the interior of the car. The irony wasn't lost on him that this symbol of his time-obsessed existence had frozen at the precise moment when time stopped mattering and presence became everything. "Jacob," Victor said urgently, suddenly aware that their private world was about to be invaded by paramedics, police officers, insurance adjusters, and all the machinery of modern emergency response. "Before they get here, I need to tell you something." Jacob turned his full attention to Victor, the same patient focus he had maintained throughout their long night together. "I wasn't driving to another business meeting when I crashed," Victor admitted. "I was running away. My investors discovered some irregularities in my books, not exactly fraud, but creative accounting that pushed every legal boundary. They were threatening to freeze my assets, seize my properties, destroy everything I'd built. I was driving to the airport to catch a flight to the Cayman Islands, where I have enough hidden assets to disappear and start over." Jacob's expression didn't change, but Victor could feel the weight of this revelation settling between them like a physical presence. The Zimmerman farm wasn't just another acquisition, Victor continued, his words coming faster now as the sound of vehicles grew closer. It was going to be my escape plan. I was going to flip it to a developer for 3 times what I paid, use the profit to pay off the most pressing debts, and buy myself enough time to liquidate other assets before anyone discovered how deeply leveraged everything really was. But you didn't make it to the airport. No, and now they'll find me here broken and helpless, and everyone will know that Victor Blackstone, the great real estate mogul, was just another con man who got caught. Victor's voice cracked. My children are going to discover that their father isn't just absent and emotionally unavailable, he's also a criminal who was willing to defraud investors and destroy communities to save his own skin. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. In the distance, Victor could make out the distinct sound of diesel engines, ambulances, or fire trucks, maybe both. Their time alone was almost over. Is that the worst thing they could discover about you? Jacob asked finally. The question caught Victor completely off guard. What do you mean? I mean, is being a criminal worse than being a father who never learned how to love his children without conditions? Is financial fraud worse than emotional fraud? Pretending to care about their dreams while really only caring about how their achievements reflect on you? Victor stared at this man who had just reframed his entire crisis in terms he'd never considered. I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing my reputation, my empire, my freedom. And now I think the worst thing that could happen is losing any chance to know my children as the people they actually are, not the people I tried to make them into. Victor closed his eyes as the full weight of this realization hit him. The empire was already lost. I was just too proud to admit it. But my relationship with Sarah and Michael, that might still be salvageable if I'm honest with them about who I really am, instead of continuing to pretend to be someone I never was. The first emergency vehicle came into view, a red ambulance, followed by a sheriff's deputy, and then, to Victor's surprise, 3 horse-drawn buggies carrying members of Jacob's community. Word had indeed spread quickly through both the English and Amish networks, bringing help from 2 worlds that rarely intersected. There's something else, Victor said quickly, knowing their private conversation was about to end. The reason I was so desperate to acquire your neighbor's farm, the reason I was willing to use legal technicalities and financial pressure, it wasn't just about the money. It was about proving I could take whatever I wanted from people who live differently than I do, people who seemed to have something I'd lost and couldn't understand. What did we seem to have? Peace, community, purpose that goes deeper than profit margins. Victor's voice grew softer as the emergency vehicles drew closer. I told myself you people were naive and backward, but really I was jealous. You had everything I thought I wanted. Family relationships that weren't based on achievement. Work that meant something beyond personal advancement. A sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Jacob reached over and gently placed his weathered hand on Victor's arm. Those things aren't exclusive to Amish communities. They're available to anyone willing to prioritize them over other pursuits. I don't know how to prioritize them. I don't even know how to recognize them when I see them. Victor felt tears mixing with the morning dew on his face. I spent so many years focused on acquiring and accumulating that I never learned how to appreciate and cherish. That's a skill like any other, Jacob said simply. It can be learned if you're willing to practice. The ambulance pulled up beside their improvised shelter, and suddenly their quiet world exploded into organized chaos. Paramedics with medical equipment, deputies with questions, community members with blankets and thermoses of coffee. Victor watched Jacob transform from his personal guardian angel into just another helpful bystander as the professionals took control of the situation. But as the paramedics worked to stabilize Victor for transport and began the careful process of extricating him from the wreckage, he kept his eyes fixed on Jacob's face. This man who had saved his life not just by tending his physical wounds, but by showing him that there might be another way to measure success, another way to build relationships, another way to spend the time he had left. "Will you visit me in the hospital?" Victor asked, as the paramedics prepared to load him into the ambulance. Jacob nodded. "If you'd like me to." "I'd like to learn," Victor said, surprising himself with the vulnerability in his voice. "About appreciating instead of accumulating. About growing things instead of just building them. About being present instead of always rushing toward the next opportunity." Jacob smiled, the expression lighting up his weathered features. "Those are good things to learn, worth taking the time to do properly." As the ambulance doors closed and Victor was whisked away toward the hospital, he caught one last glimpse of Jacob standing beside his community members, his hand raised in a simple gesture of farewell. The Amish elder who had spent the night saving a stranger's life was already turning back to help the deputies and paramedics clean up the scene, ready to assist in whatever way was needed without expecting recognition or reward. For the first time in his adult life, Victor understood what it meant to witness grace in action, not as a theological concept or a business strategy, but as a way of moving through the world that created value for everyone it touched. As the miles rolled away beneath the ambulance wheels, carrying him toward medical treatment and legal consequences he couldn't yet imagine, Victor found himself hoping he might somehow learn to live with even a fraction of the quiet dignity he had witnessed in Jacob Miller. The broken watch on his chest continued its silence, but Victor no longer felt the need to know exactly what time it was. For the first time in years, he was completely present in the moment he was living, and that felt like the beginning of something more valuable than any empire he had ever built or lost. 3 days later, Jacob arrived at Lancaster General Hospital carrying a manila envelope that would change everything Victor thought he understood about their encounter on the storm-swept road. Victor had spent those days drifting in and out of consciousness, undergoing surgeries to repair internal injuries and set broken bones, while federal investigators seized his assets and his children flew in from opposite coasts to sit vigil beside a father they barely knew. Jacob found Victor, alert but heavily medicated, his body immobilized by traction devices and his spirit seemingly broken by the weight of his collapsed empire. Sarah sat beside the bed, reading a book about education reform, while Michael worked quietly on his laptop in the corner, editing photographs from his latest documentary project. Both looked up when Jacob entered, recognizing him from news reports. "About the Good Samaritan who had saved their father's life. I need to show you something," Jacob said without preamble, setting the envelope on Victor's bedside table. "But first, I want your children to hear what I'm about to tell you." Victor's eyes widened with alarm. "Jacob, please." "Whatever it is, we can discuss it privately." "No," Jacob said firmly. "What I have to say affects them too, and they have a right to know." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, then moved closer to their father's bed. Despite years of strained relationships and disappointed expectations, they had dropped everything to be here when Victor needed them most. The crisis had stripped away pretense and left only the fundamental truth that he was their father, flawed and failing, but still family. Jacob opened the envelope and spread its contents across Victor's hospital table. Legal documents, property, surveys, financial records, and architectural plans that told a story Victor had never suspected. As he began to explain what the papers revealed, Victor felt his understanding of reality shift like tectonic plates rearranging themselves beneath his feet. "These are the real development plans for Lancaster County," Jacob said, pointing to detailed architectural drawings that showed not just the Zimmerman farm, but the entire Amish settlement, shopping centers, luxury housing developments, resort, hotels, golf courses, entertainment complexes. Every piece of land in our community was targeted for acquisition and development. Victor stared at the plans, his face growing pale as he recognized the scope and sophistication of the project. This wasn't his small-scale operation using shell companies and legal technicalities. This was something far larger and more systematic. "Where did you get these?" Victor whispered. "From your briefcase," Jacob replied simply. "It was thrown clear of the car during the crash. I found it after the ambulance left and thought you might need the documents for insurance purposes. When I opened it to see what was inside, I discovered this." Sarah leaned forward to examine the papers more closely. "Dad, these aren't your documents. The letterhead is from Meridian Development Group. I've never heard you mention that company. Victor's." Mouth fell open as he read the documents more carefully. Meridian Development Group was his biggest competitor, a ruthless corporation known for acquiring entire communities and transforming them into profitable tourist destinations. He had lost several deals to Meridian over the years and had always suspected they had access to financing and political connections he couldn't match. "I don't understand," Victor said, his voice barely audible. "How did these plans end up in my briefcase?" Jacob pulled out a business card clipped to one of the documents. It was Victor's own card, but with handwritten notes on the back that weren't in his handwriting. "Acquisition agent Victor Blackstone. Target complete Amish settlement. Timeline 18 months. Commission 15% of gross development value." The implications hit Victor like a physical blow. Someone was using me, my company, my reputation, my relationships with local officials and legal contacts. They were positioning me as the front man for their acquisition strategy. Michael looked up from his laptop screen, where he had been researching Meridian Development Group. "Dad, this company has done this before. They identify smaller developers in target areas and manipulate them into doing the initial groundwork, getting permits, establishing relationships, softening up local resistance. Then they move in and buy out the smaller developers' contracts and properties for a fraction of their real value." "But I never agreed to work with Meridian," Victor protested. "I never signed any agreements with them or even met with their representatives." Jacob pulled out the final document from the envelope, a letter of intent bearing Victor's signature, dated just 1 week before the crash. Victor stared at his own signature, knowing he had never seen the document before in his life. "This is impossible. I would remember signing something this significant." Sarah took the letter and examined it closely. As an honor student with plans to attend law school before pursuing education, she had developed a sharp eye for legal documents during her pre-law courses. "Dad, this signature looks exactly like yours, but something's wrong with the paper. See how the letterhead looks slightly different from the other documents? And the way the signature sits on the page suggests it might have been transferred from another document." The room fell silent as the full scope of the deception became clear. Victor hadn't been a predator targeting the Amish community. He had been prey himself, manipulated by a larger predator into doing their advance work without even realizing it. His legitimate business dealings, his legal property acquisitions, even his financial difficulties had all been orchestrated by Meridian to put him in the perfect position to be their unwitting agent. "The irregularities your investors discovered," Jacob said quietly, "the financial pressure that made you feel desperate enough to run, were those real problems, or were they created to push you into making choices you wouldn't have made otherwise?" Victor closed his eyes, his mind racing back through the past year of increasingly desperate business decisions. The loans that seemed too good to be true, but came with complex terms he hadn't fully understood. The investment opportunities that promised quick returns, but required him to leverage more assets than he was comfortable risking. The legal advice from attorneys he'd never worked with before, but who came highly recommended by trusted colleagues. "They set me up," Victor breathed. "Every step of the way, they set me up to fail so they could swoop in and take control of everything I'd built. Not just my properties, but my relationships, my reputation, my access to the community." "But why?" Sarah asked. "If they're as big as Michael's research suggests, why would they need to manipulate a smaller developer?" Jacob answered before Victor could. because communities like ours don't trust big corporations, especially ones with histories of destroying traditional ways of life. But we might trust a local developer who had built relationships over time, who understood our values and seemed to respect our choices. By using your father as a front, they could gain access to our community in a way that would have been impossible if they'd approached us directly. The revelation recontextualized everything Victor had experienced over the past year. His increasing financial pressure, his growing desperation, even his presence on that country road during the storm, all of it had been orchestrated by people who saw him as nothing more than a useful tool to be discarded once he had served. Their purpose? There's more, Jacob said, pulling out a final set of documents. These are financial records showing payments made to various officials and contractors over the past 2 years. Planning commissioners, zoning board members, environmental consultants, even some of the lawyers who gave you advice about eminent domain procedures. They were all being paid by Meridian to smooth the way for your acquisitions. Victor studied the payment records with growing horror. Every person he had trusted, every professional relationship he had relied on, had been compromised from the beginning. He hadn't been building an empire. He had been building a trap for himself and for the community he had thought he was exploiting. The night of the crash, Victor said slowly, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be from the SEC, saying there was an investigation into my business practices and that I needed to appear for questioning the next morning. That's what sent me into a panic. That's why I was running. Michael looked up from his laptop again. Dad, I can't find any record of an SEC investigation into your company, but look at this. He turned the screen toward his father, showing a news article, dated just 2 days after the crash. Meridian Development Group announced they had acquired the development rights to several properties in Lancaster County through a partnership agreement with local developer Victor Blackstone, who was tragically injured in a car accident while working on the project. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Victor's crash hadn't derailed their plan, it had completed it. With him incapacitated and facing apparent financial ruin, Meridian could present themselves as the responsible corporate citizen, stepping in to fulfill contractual obligations to the community, while positioning Victor as the unreliable small-time developer who had gotten in over his head. They never intended for me to complete the project myself, Victor realized. They just needed me to do enough groundwork that they could claim legal standing to move forward without me. My crash was probably the best thing that could have happened. To their timeline, Sarah reached over and took her father's hand, the first time she had voluntarily touched him in years. Dad, this means you're not the villain in this story. You were manipulated and used, but you weren't the mastermind of some plot to destroy this community. Victor felt a complex mix of relief and shame. Relief that he wasn't the calculating predator he had believed himself to be, but shame that he had been naive enough to be manipulated so completely. But I still made the choice to prioritize profit over people. I still decided that acquiring property was more important than understanding the impact on the families who lived there. The fact that I was being manipulated doesn't excuse the choices I made along the way. Jacob nodded approvingly. That's honest, and honesty is where real change begins. What happens now? Michael asked. If Meridian is using forged documents and manipulated relationships, can't we expose them? Stop their development plans? Jacob's expression grew grim. We can try, but Meridian has resources and legal connections that make them very difficult to fight. They've been doing this for years, and they're very good at covering their tracks. By the time communities realize what's happening, it's usually too late to stop the process. Victor struggled to sit up straighter despite his injuries, his mind beginning to work in ways it hadn't since the crash. But they made one mistake. They kept me alive to be their patsy. But that means I have access to information they probably don't realize I have. Financial records, correspondence, documentation of meetings and conversations that could prove the manipulation. You'd be willing to fight them? Sarah asked, surprise clear in her voice, even knowing it could mean exposing all your business practices to legal scrutiny, even knowing you might lose everything you've built. Victor looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. He saw intelligence and compassion and a fierce sense of justice that reminded him of the man he had once been, before success had hardened him into someone who measured everything in terms of personal advantage. I've already lost everything that mattered, Victor said quietly. My relationship with you and Michael, my integrity, my sense of purpose beyond personal gain. If fighting Meridian gives me a chance to rebuild some of that, then yes, I'm willing to risk whatever's left of my empire. Jacob stood up and began collecting the documents, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. There's something else you should know. The reason I was on that road the night you crashed wasn't coincidence. I'd been driving around the county for weeks, trying to understand who was behind all the sudden pressure on our community to sell their farms. I was coming back from a meeting with the Zimmermans when I saw your car. You were investigating me. I was investigating the situation. But I have to admit, when I first saw you in that wreckage, there was a moment when I thought about just walking away. You represented everything that threatened our way of life. It would have been easy to tell myself that you had brought your fate on yourself. Victor felt his throat tighten with emotion. But you didn't walk away. No, I didn't. Because that moment taught me something important about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice would have been stopping you from harming our community. Revenge would have been letting you die because of what I thought you had chosen to do. But Grace was helping you live so you could have the chance to choose differently. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, seeing her father not as the distant, successful businessman she had grown up resenting, but as a flawed human being who had lost his way and been given a second chance to find it again. So what's our next step? Michael asked, already thinking like a documentarian about how to expose the truth of what had happened. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Our first step is to help your father heal, not just his body, but his understanding of what it means to build something that serves others instead of just serving himself. The fight against Meridian will be long and difficult, but it's not a fight any of us has to face alone. As visiting hours ended and Victor's children prepared to leave for the night, Victor realized that the man who had saved his life on a country road had done something even more valuable. He had shown Victor who he could choose to become instead of who he had allowed himself to become. The documents scattered across his hospital table weren't just evidence of corporate manipulation. They were a roadmap toward redemption that would require everything he had learned about patience, community, and the kind of building that created lasting value for everyone it touched. For the first time since the crash, Victor felt something more powerful than fear or shame or regret. He felt purpose, not the hollow ambition that had driven him for years, but the quiet determination that comes from finally understanding what's worth fighting for. 2 weeks after the revelation in the hospital room, Victor sat in his wheelchair on the porch of Jacob's farmhouse, his walking stick propped against the railing beside him. The stick was a gift from Jacob, hand-carved from oak that had grown on the Miller family land for over a century, its surface smooth from careful craftsmanship, and already worn by Victor's grateful hands. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he watched Sarah and Michael work with members of the Amish community to organize the evidence that would form their case against Meridian Development Group. The walking stick represented more than just physical support for Victor's healing body. It symbolized the slow, patient work of building something that would last. Jacob had spent months carving it during the dark winter after Martha's death, working by lamplight when sleep wouldn't come, letting the rhythm of knife against wood help him process his grief. Now it served a different purpose, helping a different Kind of healing, but the same principles applied. Patience, persistence, and faith that careful work would eventually bear fruit. "Tell me again why you're helping us," Victor said to Jacob, who sat beside him in a simple wooden chair that had probably been handmade by his grandfather. "You have every reason to want Meridian stopped, but you also have every reason not to trust me. 3 weeks ago, I was still your enemy." Jacob considered the question while whittling a new handle for a garden tool, his hands never idle even. In conversation, 3 weeks ago you were Meridian's enemy too, you just didn't know it yet. Sometimes the best way to defeat a common enemy is to turn their weapons against them. Is that what I am? A weapon? You're someone who understands how their world works, who has access to information and connections they need to hide their activities. But more than that, you're someone who has a personal stake in seeing justice done, not just for our community, but for yourself and your children. Victor watched Sarah deep in conversation with Rebecca, Jacob's granddaughter, comparing notes about corporate law and community organizing. Despite growing up in completely different worlds, the two young women had found common ground in their shared sense of justice and their determination to protect things they valued from those who would exploit them for profit. "Sarah could have gone back to Princeton after I was stabilized," Victor mused. She'd already missed 2 weeks of classes. But she called her professors and arranged to take her exams remotely so she could stay and help with the case. "Are you surprised?" Victor thought about it honestly. Yes and no. I'm surprised because I'd convinced myself that she only cared about her own academic success. But I'm not surprised because when I really think about who she is, not who I tried to make her into, but who she chose to become, fighting for other people is exactly what I should have expected. Michael emerged from the house carrying his camera equipment and a laptop computer. Over the past 2 weeks, he had been documenting not just the evidence of Meridian's manipulation, but the daily life of the Amish community that was threatened by their development plans. His photographs captured the quiet dignity of people who lived according to principles that prioritized community over individual gain, sustainability over short-term profit, and human relationships over economic transactions. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," Victor said to Jacob, "about growing things instead of building them. I think I'm beginning to understand the difference, but I still don't know if I'm capable of the kind of patience it requires." Jacob set down his whittling and turned to face Victor directly. "What do you think has been happening these past 2 weeks? We've been gathering evidence, building a legal case, preparing to fight Meridian in court." "Yes, but what else?" Victor followed Jacob's gaze across the farmyard, where Sarah was now helping Rebecca hang laundry on lines strung between wooden posts. Michael was photographing 2 elderly men as they repaired a stone fence, their weathered hands working with practiced efficiency. Other community members came and went throughout the day, bringing food, sharing information, offering help with tasks that needed doing. "We've been becoming something we weren't before," Victor realized. "Not just a collection of people with a common problem, but actually a community working together toward a common goal." "And how has that felt different from the way you used to build things?" Victor struggled to articulate something he was still learning to recognize. "When I built my real estate empire, every success felt temporary because I was always worried about the next threat, the next competitor, the next economic downturn that might undo everything I'd accomplished. But this, working with all of you to fight Meridian, feels more solid somehow, even though we don't know if we'll win." "Why do you think that is?" "Because I'm not carrying the weight of it alone, because the success doesn't depend entirely on my individual effort or intelligence or resources, because even if we lose, the relationships we've built and the things we've learned will still exist." Jacob nodded approvingly. "Martha used to say that the difference between a building and a garden is that buildings fight against nature while gardens work with it. You can force a building to stand through engineering and materials, But a garden only thrives when you understand what each plant needs and how they support each other. A car pulled into the gravel driveway, a black sedan that immediately put everyone on alert. Corporate lawyers had been circling like vultures ever since word leaked that Victor was cooperating with community leaders to challenge Meridian's development plans. But as the car stopped and its occupant emerged, Victor felt his heart skip with recognition and dread. Thomas Meridian himself stepped out of the sedan, his expensive suit and polished shoes looking absurdly out of place in the farmyard setting. He was younger than Victor had expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having faced a problem that money and lawyers couldn't solve. "Mr. Blackstone," Meridian called out as he approached the porch. "I was hoping we could have a private conversation. I think there's been some misunderstanding about our business relationship." Victor felt his hands tighten on his walking stick, but Jacob's calm presence beside him helped him maintain composure. Sarah and Michael had noticed the visitor and were moving closer to the house, along with several community members who had been working nearby. "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding," Victor replied carefully. "I think I understand our relationship quite clearly now." Meridian smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I think you'll find that challenging our acquisition. Plans will be much more difficult and expensive than you imagine. We have resources and legal connections that could make life very complicated for someone in your current financial position." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering you an opportunity to reconsider your options. We could still structure a partnership that would be profitable for both of us. Your cooperation would be valuable, and we're prepared to compensate you generously." Before it, Victor looked at this man who had spent months manipulating him, destroying his business, and positioning him to take the blame for a scheme he had never fully understood. 3 weeks ago, Meridian's offer might have been tempting, a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of his empire, to avoid the legal and financial consequences of his situation. Now, surrounded by people who had welcomed him into their community, despite having every reason to mistrust him, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The clarity that comes from knowing exactly who you want to be and what you're willing to sacrifice to become that person. "I appreciate the offer," Victor said steadily, "but I'm not interested in partnership with people who build their success by destroying other people's lives." And Meridian's friendly facade dropped completely. "You're making a mistake, Blackstone. We have enough evidence of your financial irregularities to destroy what's left of your reputation and put you in federal prison. Your children's futures, their college funds, their inheritance, all of it will disappear if you continue down this path." Victor felt fear grip his heart, not for himself, but for Sarah and Michael, who had already sacrificed so much to stand by him. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward from where she had been listening. "Mr. Meridian," she said with the quiet authority that had made her valedictorian, "I think you should know that everything you've said in the past 5 minutes has been recorded by my brother's documentary equipment, and there are witnesses present who can testify about your attempt to intimidate my father." Michael held up his camera with a slight smile. "I've been documenting corporate intimidation tactics as part of my project about community resistance to predatory development. This conversation will make an excellent addition to the film." Meridian looked around at the circle of faces watching him. Amish community members who had lived their entire lives according to principles he didn't understand. Young people who refused to be impressed by his wealth and power, and a broken man who had somehow found the strength to choose integrity over self-preservation. "This isn't over," Meridian said as he retreated toward his car. "We have lawyers and resources you can't imagine. We'll bury you in litigation and legal fees until you beg us to accept your surrender." As the black sedan disappeared down the country road, Victor felt something settle in his chest, a quiet determination that had nothing to do with anger or revenge, and everything to do with protecting something precious that had grown slowly. In soil prepared by patience and tended by love, Jacob resumed his whittling, his movements calm and unhurried despite the confrontation they had just witnessed. "Well," he said mildly, "I guess we know what we're up against now." Victor gripped his walking stick more tightly, feeling its solid weight and remembering the months of careful work that had gone into its creation. "Yes," he said firmly, "and I guess they know what they're up against too." The Lancaster County courthouse had never seen anything quite like the crowd that gathered on a crisp October morning 6 weeks after Victor's crash. 3 television news crews set up equipment on the courthouse steps while reporters interviewed community members about the David and Goliath legal battle about to unfold inside. Meridian Development Group had arrived with a team of corporate lawyers in matching dark suits, briefcases full of precedents and procedural motions designed to overwhelm any opposition. But they hadn't counted on the coalition that Jacob and Victor had built together, Amish community leaders who rarely involved themselves in English legal proceedings, environmental activists who understood the broader implications of corporate land grabbing, legal aid attorneys who specialized in community defense, and investigative journalists who had been documenting similar cases across rural America. Victor sat at the plaintiff's table in his first real suit in 2 months, his walking stick propped against his chair. Beside him, Sarah wore the professional attire of someone who had spent the past month cramming on corporate law instead of studying education theory. Michael had positioned himself in the gallery with his camera, ready to document whatever unfolded. The medical equipment that had surrounded Victor for weeks was gone, but its symbolic presence remained in the person of Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the emergency room physician who had treated him the night of the crash and who would testify about the suspicious timing of his accident and the phone calls that had triggered his desperate flight. Judge Patricia Hensley called the courtroom to order with the weary efficiency of someone who had presided over countless battles between corporate interests and community values. She had reviewed the preliminary evidence and understood that this case was about much more than property development. It was about the methods corporations could use to manipulate individuals and communities into serving their interests. Meridian's lead attorney Richard Sterling opened with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to winning through superior resources and legal maneuvering. "Your Honor, this case is a simple matter of a failed businessman attempting to blame his poor choices on others. Mr. Blackstone entered into legitimate business relationships, made decisions that proved financially unsound, and is now trying to avoid the consequences by fabricating claims of corporate manipulation." Sterling presented documents and witnesses with practiced efficiency, financial records showing Victor's mounting debts, testimony from creditors about his increasingly desperate attempts to secure funding, evidence of the legal and financial decisions that had led to his current situation. On the surface, it was a compelling narrative of personal failure and professional irresponsibility. But when Victor's attorney, Maria Santos, from the Rural Communities Legal Defense Fund, began her presentation, the real story started to emerge. She methodically introduced evidence of the systematic manipulation that had preceded every major financial decision Victor had made over the past year. "Ladies and gentlemen," Santos said, addressing not just the judge, but the packed gallery of community members and reporters, "what we have here is not a case of business failure, but a case of business predation. Meridian Development Group identified a successful regional developer systematically undermined his financial stability, manipulated his business relationships, and positioned him to take legal and financial responsibility for a development scheme he never fully understood." The first piece of evidence was Victor's signature on the Meridian Letter of Intent, the document that had so shocked him in the hospital. Santos had commissioned a forensic analysis that revealed the signature had indeed been transferred from another document using sophisticated but detectable technology. This forged signature, Santos explained, was the linchpin of Meridian's entire scheme. With this document, they could claim legal authority to proceed with development plans using Mr. Blackstone as their designated representative, whether he was capable of fulfilling that role or not. Sterling objected vigorously, arguing that the signature analysis was inconclusive and that the document represented a standard business agreement that Victor had simply forgotten in the trauma surrounding his accident. But Dr. Warren's testimony about Victor's mental state and the timing of his panic added credibility to the claims of manipulation. The most damaging evidence came from Jacob himself, who testified about finding the Meridian documents in Victor's briefcase and his subsequent investigation into the company's history of similar schemes in other rural communities. "I've lived in Lancaster County for 62 years, Jacob said from the witness stand, his plain clothes and quiet dignity creating a stark contrast to the corporate lawyers surrounding him. "I've seen developers come and go, and I understand that change is part of life. But what Meridian was doing wasn't development. It was deception designed to destroy communities that couldn't defend themselves against corporate manipulation." Sterling's cross-examination of Jacob was brief and ineffective. The lawyer clearly hadn't expected to face a witness who couldn't be intimidated or confused, someone whose credibility was unshakable and whose motives were transparently honest. But the real turning point came when Victor himself took the stand. Santos had coached him carefully, but ultimately his testimony would succeed or fail based on his willingness to take complete responsibility for his choices while still exposing the manipulation that had influenced those choices. "Mr. Blackstone," Santos began, "please tell the court about your business relationship with Meridian Development Group." Victor gripped the witness stand rail, feeling the same solid support his walking stick provided. "I thought I didn't have a business relationship with Meridian Development Group. I thought I was building my own real estate empire, making my own decisions, pursuing my own opportunities. I now understand that for at least a year, possibly longer, my business decisions were being influenced by people I never met, working for a company I never knowingly agreed to partner with." "How were your decisions influenced?" "Through financial pressure that made me desperate enough to take risks I wouldn't normally take. Through legal advice from attorneys I thought were independent, but who were actually being paid by Meridian. Through investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true, but came with terms that gradually put me deeper in debt and more dependent on their continued support." Victor's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But I want to be clear about something. The manipulation doesn't excuse the choices I made. I chose to prioritize profit over people. I chose to acquire property without fully considering the impact on families and communities. I chose to build an empire based on taking rather than giving. Meridian may have created the circumstances that led to those choices, but the choices were still mine to make." This admission seemed to catch even Sterling off guard. Most defendants in corporate manipulation cases tried to claim complete innocence, arguing that they bore no responsibility for actions taken under influence. Victor's willingness to accept responsibility for his choices while still exposing the manipulation that influenced them created a more complex and ultimately more credible narrative. "What changed your perspective, Mr. Blackstone?" Victor looked out at the gallery, seeing Sarah and Michael in the front row, Jacob sitting with other community leaders, and the faces of people who had welcomed him into their lives despite having every reason to mistrust him. "I learned what it feels like to be helped without conditions, to be part of something larger than my own interests, to build something that serves others instead of just serving myself. I learned the difference between success that isolates you and success that connects you to other people." The cross-examination was brutal, but ultimately ineffective. Sterling tried to portray Victor as a calculating manipulator who was using claims of corporate victimization to avoid responsibility for his crimes. But Victor's consistent acceptance of responsibility for his choices, combined with his obvious transformation over the past 2 months, made it difficult to paint him as purely self-serving. As the morning session ended and the court recessed for lunch, Victor felt exhausted but oddly hopeful. The truth was finally being told, not just about Meridian's manipulation, but about his own choices and the possibility of redemption that comes from facing those choices honestly. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and reporters, Victor leaned heavily on his walking stick and tried to answer questions about what he hoped to achieve with the lawsuit. "I hope to stop Meridian from destroying communities the way they almost destroyed me," he said simply. "But more than that, I hope to show other people who have made choices they're not proud of that it's never too late to choose differently, that you can't undo the past, but you can still decide who you want to become." As they prepared to return for the afternoon session, Jacob approached Victor with a quiet confidence that had become familiar over their weeks of working together. "How do you think it's going?" Victor asked. Jacob smiled, the expression lighting up his weathered features. "Truth has a weight to it that lies can never match. We've told the truth. Now we wait and see if justice has the strength to carry that." Wait. The afternoon session began with an unexpected development that changed the entire trajectory of the trial. As Judge Hensley called the court to order, Sterling stood and requested a brief recess to consult with his clients. The corporate lawyers huddled in whispered conference, while Meridian executives made urgent phone calls in the hallway, their previously confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Victor watched this activity with growing curiosity, wondering what could have shaken Meridian's legal team so thoroughly. The answer came when court resumed, and Sterling made a motion that shocked everyone present. "Your Honor, based on new information that has come to light during the lunch recess, Meridian Development Group would like to enter into settlement negotiations with the plaintiffs." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Judge Hensley gavelled for order, while Victor stared at his attorney in confusion. They had prepared for a long, difficult legal battle, not for Meridian to capitulate before the case was even fully presented. Maria Santos requested a brief recess to consult with her clients, and during the break she explained what had happened. "Michael's documentary footage from this morning was posted online during lunch break. It's already been viewed over 1 million times and picked up by major news networks. More importantly, it's prompted other communities to come forward with evidence of similar Meridian schemes in their areas." She showed Victor her phone, where news alerts were flooding in about investigations being launched in 3 other states. Stock prices falling as investors discovered the scope of Meridian's manipulative practices, and congressional representatives calling for hearings about corporate land grabbing in rural communities. "They want to settle because this is no longer just about Lancaster County," Santos explained. "This has become a national story about corporate accountability, and they can't afford to have all their other operations exposed to similar scrutiny." But as Victor considered Meridian's settlement offer, he realized something that surprised him. He didn't want to settle, not because of greed or revenge, but because the community deserved to have their story fully told and their victory officially recognized. "We've come this far together," Victor said to Jacob and the other community. Leaders gathered around him. "If we settle now, Meridian gets to control the narrative. They get to frame this as a business dispute rather than expose it as the systematic manipulation it really was." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we finish what we started. Let the judge make the ruling based on the evidence. Accept whatever consequences come from that, but make sure the truth is officially recognized." It was Sarah who pointed out the risk. "Dad, if we reject the settlement and lose the case, you could face criminal charges for the financial irregularities they've documented. Meridian's settlement offer includes immunity from prosecution." Victor looked at his daughter. this remarkable young woman who had put her own future on hold to stand beside him, and felt a clarity he had never experienced before. Some things are more important than avoiding consequences. The people in this community took a risk when they trusted me despite having every reason not to. I'm not going to abandon that trust now just to protect myself. When court resumed, Victor stood to address Judge Hensley directly. The hospital visitor badge he had worn for weeks was pinned to his jacket lapel, not because he needed it anymore, but because it represented Jacob's commitment to staying beside him through the worst of his recovery. Now, it symbolized Victor's own commitment to seeing this process through to its conclusion. Your Honor, we respectfully decline Meridian Development Group's settlement offer. We believe this community deserves to have their case heard completely and decided on its merits. The judge's expression suggested she had rarely seen defendants reject favorable settlement terms for principled reasons. Sterling looked genuinely shocked that Victor would risk criminal prosecution rather than accept the financial protection Meridian was offering. The afternoon testimony focused on the broader pattern of Meridian's operations, with expert witnesses and community leaders from other states testifying about similar manipulation schemes that had destroyed family farms and traditional communities across rural America. Michael's documentary footage provided visual evidence of the human cost of these corporate tactics, showing families displaced, traditions ended, and communities scattered. But it was Jacob's closing testimony that provided the emotional heart of their case. Speaking directly to Judge Hensley, he articulated something that transcended legal precedent and touched on fundamental questions about how communities should be allowed to determine their own futures. Your Honor, this case isn't really about property development or business contracts. It's about whether corporations should be allowed to manipulate individuals and communities into serving their interests without those people understanding what's being asked of them. Victor Blackstone made mistakes, but he made them based on false information provided by people who were deliberately deceiving him. Our community was targeted for destruction by people who never asked what we wanted or needed, who never considered that our way of life might have value that couldn't be measured in dollars. Jacob's voice grew stronger as he continued, "We're not asking for special protection or exemption from economic reality. We're asking for the right to make informed decisions about our own futures based on honest information about our options. We're asking for the same respect that any community deserves when outside interests want to change everything about how we live." When testimony concluded and Judge Hensley retired to consider her decision, the packed courtroom remained unusually quiet. Victor sat surrounded by people who had become his family over the past 2 months. Not just Sarah and Michael, but Jacob and Rebecca and dozens of community members who had welcomed him despite his history of working against their interests. "Whatever happens," Victor said quietly to Jacob, "I want you to know that these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life. Not because of the legal case, but because of what you've all taught me about what it means to be part of something larger than yourself." Jacob smiled, his weathered face peaceful in the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. "You've taught us something too, that it's never too late for someone to choose who they want to become, and that sometimes the people who seem most different from us have the most important lessons to offer." When Judge Hensley returned with her decision, the courtroom fell completely silent. Victor gripped his walking stick and felt the solid presence of Jacob beside him, surrounded by a community that had grown stronger through the process of fighting for something they all believed in. "In the matter of Miller vs. Meridian Development Group," the judge began, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that would influence how corporate manipulation cases would be handled for years to come. "This court finds..." Victor closed his eyes and prepared to accept whatever consequences came from choosing truth over safety, community over self-protection, and the long, difficult work of redemption over the easy path of avoiding responsibility for the choices that had brought him to this moment. 6 months later, Victor stood in the morning sunlight outside the Lancaster County Recorder of Deeds office, holding a set of documents that represented more than legal paperwork. They represented the completion of a transformation that had begun on a storm-swept country road with 5 simple words: "I won't let you die today." The new deed papers in his hands bore the names of 7 Amish families, including the Zimmermans, whose farm Victor was formally returning to them, along with compensation for the hardship his original acquisition had caused. Judge Hensley's ruling had not only found Meridian guilty of corporate manipulation and fraud, but had also invalidated all property transfers made under their influence. The victory had been complete. Meridian's development plans were permanently blocked, their executives faced federal criminal charges, and their stock price had collapsed as investigations in 12 states revealed the scope of their predatory practices. But Victor's satisfaction came not from Meridian's downfall, but from what he had built in its place. The Blackstone Community Foundation, established with the remaining assets from his former empire, now funded medical care, education, and small business development in rural communities across Pennsylvania. Sarah had deferred law school for a year to serve as the foundation's first executive director, while Michael's documentary about corporate land grabbing had won recognition at film festivals and sparked congressional hearings about rural community protection. Jacob approached across the courthouse square, moving with the steady pace that had become so familiar to Victor over their months of working together. At 72, the Amish elder showed no signs of slowing down, his commitment to community service as strong as ever. In his weathered hands, he carried something wrapped in simple brown paper, a gift that would mark the official conclusion of their legal battle and the beginning of whatever came next. "The last of the paperwork is filed," Victor announced as Jacob joined him on the courthouse steps. "The Zimmerman farm is officially back in the family, along with the 3 other properties Meridian acquired through my company." Jacob nodded, with quiet satisfaction. "Old Heinrich Zimmerman cried when I told him yesterday. First time I've seen tears on that man's face since his wife passed 10 years ago. Happy tears, I hope. The happiest kind. He said he never thought he'd see his granddaughter playing in those fields again." Jacob handed Victor the wrapped package. "This is from the community. We wanted you to have something to remember what we've all learned together." Victor unwrapped the paper to reveal a photograph in a simple wooden frame, the image of a barn raising that had taken place just last month. In the center of the picture, Victor could see himself working alongside Jacob and dozens of community members to construct a new barn for a young family whose old one had been destroyed by a tornado. His walking stick was propped against a sawhorse nearby, and his face showed the kind of deep satisfaction that came from building something that would serve others for generations. "Michael took this picture," Jacob explained. "He said it captured something important about the difference between building for yourself and building with others." Victor studied the photograph, remembering the day with perfect clarity. His hands had been soft from years of office work, and by evening they were blistered and sore from handling unfamiliar tools. But the physical discomfort had been completely overshadowed by the experience of creating something beautiful and functional through shared effort and mutual support. "I've had photographs taken with politicians and celebrities, at award ceremonies and ribbon cuttings," Victor said thoughtfully. "But this is the first picture I've ever seen of myself where I actually look happy. Not successful or important or powerful, just genuinely happy." They walked together toward Jacob's buggy, where his horse waited with the patient endurance that seemed to characterize everything in the Amish world. The contrast between the horse-drawn vehicle and the expensive cars in the courthouse parking lot no longer seemed quaint or backward to Victor. It seemed like a conscious choice to move through the world at a pace that allowed for reflection and genuine connection. "What's next for you?" Jacob asked as they reached the buggy. "The foundation work will keep you busy, but that's not the same as having a home community." Victor had been wrestling with this question for weeks. His legal troubles were resolved. His children had forgiven him and wanted to rebuild their relationships. And his former business empire had been transformed into something that served others instead of just enriching himself. But where did a man in his 50s go to start over when everything familiar had been stripped away? Sarah suggested I might consider teaching, Victor said. Business ethics at a community college. Maybe helping other people avoid the mistakes I made. Michael thinks I should write a book about what happened. Use my story to warn others about corporate manipulation tactics. Those sound like good ways to serve others with what you've learned. But I asked, what's next for you? Not what's next for your work. Jacob's distinction hit Victor with surprising force. For his entire adult life, he had defined himself by his work. His identity had been so completely wrapped up in his professional success that he had never developed a sense of who he was beyond his achievements. Now forced to discover that identity from scratch, he found himself uncertain about even basic questions. I don't know, Victor admitted. I've spent so much time being Victor Blackstone, the real estate developer, that I'm not sure who Victor Blackstone, the person, is supposed to be. Jacob climbed into his buggy and gathered the reins but made no move to leave. Can I tell you what I see when I look at you now? Please. I see a man who has learned the hardest lesson anyone can learn. That real strength comes from admitting weakness, that real wealth comes from giving rather than taking, and that real success comes from building things that serve others long after you're gone. Jacob's weathered face was serious but kind. Most importantly, I see a man who has learned how to accept help without shame and offer help without expecting anything in return. Victor felt tears threatening, but for the first time in months they were tears of gratitude rather than regret. You saved my life that night, Jacob. Not just my physical life, but everything that matters about being human. We saved each other, Jacob replied simply. You taught me that even people who seem to be enemies can become family if you're willing to see past the surface to the person underneath. You reminded me that grace isn't just about forgiving people who deserve it. It's about loving people into becoming who they're meant to be. As Jacob's buggy pulled away from the courthouse square, Victor stood holding the framed photograph and the deed papers, surrounded by the spring morning sounds of a community going about its daily business. Children walked to school in groups, shopkeepers opened their doors, farmers drove tractors toward fields that would soon be planted with crops that would feed families through the coming winter. For the first time in his adult life, Victor felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of what he owned or what he had accomplished, but simply because he had learned how to be present for other people when they needed him. The walking stick Jacob had carved for him leaned against his leg, solid and reliable, a reminder that the most valuable things in life were created slowly, with patience and love, by hands that understood the difference between building something and growing something. He thought about the words Jacob had spoken that night in the wreckage. I won't let you die today. At the time, Victor had assumed Jacob meant physical death, the immediate threat of bleeding out in a crashed car on a lonely road. Now he understood that Jacob had been talking about something much more profound. He had refused to let Victor's capacity for redemption die, his ability to change and grow and become someone worthy of the second chance he was being offered. 6 months later, Victor Blackstone was very much alive, not just breathing and walking and working, but fully present. In his own life, for the first time since childhood, he had learned what it meant to be part of a community, to build relationships that served others instead of just serving himself, to measure success by the love he gave rather than the wealth he accumulated. As he walked toward his modest apartment, above the foundation offices, Victor felt the solid weight of his walking stick and the warm presence of the morning sun on his face. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of children laughing and the gentle rhythm of horses' hooves on pavement, the sounds of a community that had welcomed him home not because of who he had been, but because of who he had chosen to become. The transformation that began with a car crash and 5 words of grace was complete, but the life those words had made possible was just beginning. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Victor Blackstone was genuinely excited to see what tomorrow might bring.